Greetings, it is I, Tempest Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue my discussion on Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, the second edition of AD&D. When we last left off, we were diving into the Dungeon Master's Guide, and of course, I'd moved into talking about combat. Most of these combat rules are more important for your Dungeon Master to know about, but you as a player may want to know them too. So let's continue with aerial combat, aerial maneuvers, as I was talking about, with the optional aerial rules. I talked about the tournament ones last time. So this is going to be based around the concept of miniatures and boards, that you're moving your aerial figures around on a miniature, on a kind of grid, either on a tabletop or a floor. Everything is going to be measured in 1-inch squares that are going to be equivalent to 10 feet. So that's the basics. It's also important to note here that all the rules from the tournament stick here unless I have a contradiction in amongst what I say now. That means that contradiction is the new rule, replacing the old one. But everything else, don't talk about it. Rule from before, still function. So maneuverability will be important, and it will be and that will tell you how much your miniature can turn once you have it on the board. Protractors might be needed, kind of put to the side, keep track of this. It might make it easier. Think about it this way. Your maneuverability tells me how much I can turn in a place, which eats up some of my movement. Then I have to move an inch forward, and I could turn again, using the same amount that my maneuverability says. So it's a combination of my turn, inch forward, turn, inch forward, turn, inch forward, and that I can use to make much larger turns, because my maneuverability might not let me to turn only a little bit with my movement. Kind of gives you an idea of how long it takes to make a big circle. Now, altitude is not tracked in the traditional way. You have a 2D board. You can't track up and down. Players keep track of it on a separate piece of paper, marking down whatever their thing is. So if I have an NPC or / monster on the board, I would keep track of it as the Dungeon Master. My players would keep track of their own altitudes, and we'd sort of compare them to figure out where everything is on the vertical scale. Now, you can rise and you can dive. When you're rising, most things with a decent maneuverability will rise about an inch per inch forward they move. Things with very poor maneuverability, they tend to be about half an inch up for each inch forward they go. And things with some of the best maneuverability could actually go straight up vertically, but very few creatures can actually go straight up vertically. That's an unusual thing to have. Diving, on the other hand, diving does do a bonus that you double effectively the speed you're doing. So if I would move down an inch, I get an extra inch of movement. Now, most creatures will move forward when they dive. They can't dive straight down very easily, so you move about an inch forward and then pretty much 2 inches down. That's going to be the most of the way that things are going to be doing the dive maneuver. Now, the dive maneuver, you don't actually have to use your full movement here. You have to move a distance, of course. You're diving down an instant. You don't just drop, because when you're diving, you're still doing a fly, but you don't have to use your full fly to it. Now, again, whatever your full movement is, if you do it, you, of course, will still have those double the inches you're moving, so effectively double the distance you'd be going down on the dive. Now, when we talk about combat in this retrospect, position is going to be key for everything. It's going to be it. You're going to ignore any dice pool modifiers for maneuverability. That's the first and foremost thing. And you have to consider anything that's more acrobatic is going to have an advantage over something that's clumsy. Players, because they're keeping track of counters and altitude and things like that, are going to be the ones keeping track of most of this information and using the maneuverability best. You're there to guide them along the way with this, the way that combat is being dealt with here. It is also, though, important to note that if you are diving, you can effectively treat it as a charge, meaning you get all the basic bonuses of a charge, and if you're using a spear or lance, it does double damage. Let's move on and talk about underwater adventures, because this is a fanciful area that is interesting and mysterious and oftentimes ignored and not used properly. You have to think about it this way. There might be ancient civilizations that have fallen beneath the waves, open to exploring, great treasures scattered along the ocean floors for you to discover, or fearsome monsters that are mysterious and alien that you may have to face down there. All of it are very classic hallmarks for an awesome adventure you might have deep below the waves. There are two major problems and one minor problem I will talk about today when it involves adventuring below the waves. Major one, breathing. Characters breathe air. It's the simplest thing. Is like, you might have an occasional character built that could breathe water, but that's very rare. That's unusual. Majority of characters, they don't. They're going to need to find a way to breathe when they're going long-term underwater. You can hold your breath for a short term, but long-term, exploring ancient cities, exploring ancient ruins, deep under the waves, exploring caves, things like that, you're going to need a way for more long-term. Spells may do it, magic items, maybe a potion of water breathing, maybe some kind of device that you can use that's been invented that is a simple device that makes you breathe. You're going to look to all of them, and if there isn't an option for using any of them for your characters, you as a dungeon master have to provide it. Because if you don't, again, holding your breath is short term. If you want a long-term adventure, you want to be able to set it up that your characters can actually do that. If they're able to provide it for themselves, great, awesome, you don't have to worry about it. But if they don't, maybe provide them with like special airbags or some kind of algae they can chew on in their mouth that gives them air. Something that allows them to travel down underwater for periods of time that normally they wouldn't have, just because of the options. Now the second problem is movement. Of course, I talked all about swimming when I talked about stuff from the player's handbook. Your characters will have to swim. The other option is sinking, which effectively you are weighted down and you just sink like a stone down to the bottom and then worry about kind of trudging along the bottom with whatever speed you got then. Both are important aspects, and it's important to remember you're going to need to do one of them when maneuvering underwater. It is a problem, not one that can be easily solved. It's either knowing how to swim or having the ability to sink down to the bottom, but they're simple ones, but still a difficulty. The last one I want to talk about is not a difficulty for all characters. Light. Your character might be able to deal with the fact you can't really see very well. You know, if you're maybe a dwarf or something. But if you're like a human, you're going to need light to see. Now, traditionally, if you go down in fresh water, you can see about 50 feet in front of you. For every 10 feet down, you subtract 10 feet from the distance you can see. To eventually it gets down to 0 and it's pitch black and you can't see anything. Ocean's a little better. Ocean, you can see farther. 100 feet away when you're sort of at the surface. Again, it's exactly the same as with the freshwater. Every 10 feet down, subtract 10 feet from that. Now, all this is assuming it's a bright, sunny day. If it's overcast, you half the basic starting distance you can see to 25 in fresh or 50 foot in ocean. If it's a moonless night, well, you can't see anything anyway. So, I mean, why would it make any difference? You're not seeing anything even under the water. It's pitch black. Figuring out how to get light down there, that's a challenge. Whether you're trying to figure out a way to somehow get a torch or a lantern down there, using some kind of magic or some kind of trick that you're coming up with, entirely up to your characters. It's a challenge that they should be able to face and figure out how can I see when I'm under the water? Granted, it's important to note that the distance that the light that you've taken down there illuminates, half from its normal. So you're not going to be able to see as far, even with the light down underwater. So that's it for today. I introduced you to, of course, optional aerial rules. Different from the tournament rules, this is more miniatures based. You're on a board, you're using rulers and protractors to measure yourself out while tracking your altitude. Very interesting and different way of taking it. From there, I moved on to talking about underwater. Traveling underwater, the basics of just what it means to go underwater. Talking about the things you're going to have to face, the problems. Breathing, moving, and seeing. Seeing being the least important out of those, but still pretty important. But all of them are challenges your characters are going to have to face, especially if you're traveling underwater. In the next episode, I'm going to move on and talk about underwater combat. Because now you're underwater, there might be one of those monsters I talked about under there that you're going to have to face. So if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything you think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. It's just a channel, The Empire, the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you go to my Patreon, link description below. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.